After a long day at work, when everything seemed to have come to an end in exhaustion and tension, Eric Porter, that man, just wanted to quickly head home. His sedan glided through the quiet streets, the night lights from the shops and restaurants softly reflecting on the pavement. He let out a sigh, telling himself that he was almost there. The atmosphere in the car seemed to envelop him, helping him forget all the worries. A quiet evening, thoughts about work, about life, seemed to gradually fade from his mind. But then, in the midst of it all, the silence was shattered by the sound of a police siren, suddenly blaring from behind. Eric glanced in the rearview mirror, the flashing red and blue lights reflected on the glass, a sign that could not be avoided. He didn't have time to prepare for this moment. Driving calmly, he slowly steered the car to the side, his heart beginning to race just a little, but his face showed no signs of concern. He knew this was just a routine traffic stop, a part of the everyday job that anyone could encounter. But no, that feeling wasn't just about a traffic check. Everything suddenly became tense when Officer Bradley Larson stepped out of the patrol car. A hard gaze from him pierced through the car window, and Eric could feel the shift in the air. This wasn't as simple as he thought. Eric looked down, took a deep breath, and slowly lowered the window. The streetlight illuminated his face, calm and composed. The questions that began from Larson weren't about a violation, but about something else, a suspicion that Eric could immediately sense. Everything began to go beyond what he had imagined, as the red lights not only reflected on the car glass anymore, but also shined directly into something deeper, where he knew that respect and justice would be tested. The conversation between Eric and Officer Larson started like an entirely ordinary situation, like any other traffic stop that every driver could face. But when Larson approached the car door, his gaze didn't stop at a simple violation. Larson's voice was cold, without any friendliness, as he asked Eric to provide his documents. The tension began to manifest in the air, even though both of them tried to maintain their composure. "You probably don't know why I stopped you, do you?" Larson asked, his eyes sharp, as if searching for some reason to go further. Eric calmly looked straight into Larson's eyes, his hands slowly handing over the documents without any rush. He knew that this question was just the first step in an unusual interrogation. "No, I'm not entirely sure," Eric answered, his voice calm but firm. Larson slightly furrowed his brow, not because of Eric's answer, but because of how Eric remained composed in this situation. A brief furrow passed across Larson's face, as if he realized something wasn't right. But he still wouldn't give up. "You didn't stop at the red light," Larson said, his tone a bit hurried, as if searching for a reason to continue the conversation. A small mistake, something that could easily be overlooked, but the tension in the air began to escalate, stemming from the suspicion Larson didn't try to hide. Eric knew this wasn't just a simple discussion about a traffic violation. The feeling inside him began to change, from a sense of ease to alertness. He could feel the difference in the way Larson looked at him, as if he wasn't just a driver violating traffic laws, but someone suspicious, someone Larson didn't know but was ready to judge. "You're not from here, are you?" Larson continued, this time with a hint of probing in his voice. The question wasn't about traffic anymore, but about Eric, about his presence in this city. Eric answered briefly, but his gaze remained calm. "I moved here a few months ago." Larson didn't respond immediately, but stared at Eric for a moment longer. That gaze was no longer just that of a police officer performing his duty, but of someone searching for something deeper. And then, Eric realized that this conversation wasn't just about stopping him for a small infraction. It was about judgment, discrimination, and a world beyond what could be seen on the surface. It was at that moment that the tension between them truly began to escalate, when Larson's questions were no longer about traffic violations, but about doubts, invisible obsessions that Eric had to face. Neither of them could have predicted that this seemingly simple traffic stop would lead to a deep confrontation, where respect and power began to reveal themselves. The conversation between Eric and Larson continued with undeniable tension. Officer Larson was not satisfied with Eric's responses, even though he couldn't find anything wrong in the words or actions of the man before him. Larson began asking questions with a tone of suspicion, increasingly as if trying to find a reason to continue the check, even though the original reason for the stop was just a minor traffic violation. "Where are you in such a hurry to go? How could you be driving so fast?" Larson asked, his tone somewhat mocking, glimmering with doubt. Eric stayed calm, not letting Larson's words affect him. He knew these questions weren't about whether he had violated traffic laws, but about Larson trying to evaluate him, trying to categorize him. Perhaps Larson was wondering how a man in a suit, driving a sedan, could make him feel this suspicious? I'm just heading home, Eric replied, still maintaining a composed tone, his eyes unwavering, unaffected. Everything he said was considered, without any rush, as if he were in control of the entire situation, even though he knew he couldn't predict Larson's next move. But Larson didn't let up. He continued to observe Eric closely, as if trying to find signs of deceit in his attitude or eyes. Where are you from? Larson asked next, and this time, the question wasn't simply a casual inquiry, but rather an interrogation, a probing. Eric answered with an astonishing calmness. I just moved here a few months ago, but Larson didn't really care about that answer. He only wanted to complicate things, to create a wall of doubt that Eric couldn't easily overcome. The atmosphere grew stifling, every question from Larson laden with sarcasm and challenge. However, what was strange was that Eric didn't react like others might have. He didn't rush to explain or justify himself. He simply held his ground, his eyes full of determination and respect, without any fear. Who are you to act like this? Larson couldn't help but silently wonder. His discomfort began to become more apparent, growing more and more uneasy. There was something in the way Eric stood upright and how he maintained his composure amid all the insinuating questions that made Larson feel as though he were the one being controlled, rather than the one in control. But Eric did not respond to the provocation. He simply smiled lightly, with no hint of challenge, just the confidence of a man who knew his place in society and was ready to stand up for his rights. Eric realized that he wasn't just facing an officer, but a symbol of a system that he knew all too well, a system he was very familiar with. And it was his calmness, not fear, not confusion, that made Larson feel uncomfortable. The tension between them was no longer just a conversation about traffic. It was a confrontation between two individuals, one confident and aware of his rights, the other trying to assert power, yet failing to recognize that true power doesn't come from threats, but from respect and understanding. Larson continued pressing with questions full of suspicion, but Eric, still holding firm to his position, was ready for the next steps that he knew would lead him to an unavoidable turning point. Like a smoldering fire waiting to ignite, the tension between Eric and Larson escalated. Though Eric remained incredibly calm, Larson's attitude had clearly begun to shift. What had started as a simple exchange over a minor traffic violation now seemed to be veering into dangerous territory. Larson, sensing the change in Eric's demeanor, couldn't help but suspect there was something hidden beneath that calmness. He could no longer settle for repeated questions. With a look of unmistakable suspicion, Larson issued a firm command, "Get out of the car." His voice was no longer a gentle request, but an order, sharp and decisive. It was no longer a doubt about Eric's behavior. It was a deep conviction that something was wrong, something that couldn't be explained by just a traffic violation. Eric, though not showing any signs of worry, could feel the atmosphere shifting. The heat of tension had spread through the air, as if every breath, every heartbeat, was faster not because of fear, but because of the growing unease forming within him. He looked into Larson's eyes, not rushing to exit the vehicle. His calmness now felt like a strong shield, but not one of coldness. Rather, it was one of understanding. He knew his next move would decide everything, and he couldn't afford to lose control. Without saying a word, Eric emphasized his determination as he slowly opened the car door. Every movement seemed calculated, like the steps of someone who had faced situations like this many times before. His eyes never left Larson's, no fear, no hesitation. He didn't need to prove himself, but he knew every action would be scrutinized. Larson stood firm, not budging, his eyes never leaving Eric, as if searching for a sign, a slip-up, a reasonable explanation for Eric's actions. The tension now felt like a taut string, ready to snap at any moment. But Eric didn't let himself get caught up in this game. He stood up, not in a rush, not making trouble. He just wanted this to end peacefully. However, Larson didn't seem to think that way. He continued pursuing his goal, as if his belief that something was off about Eric was becoming more certain. The psychological storm had never been more intense. As Eric stepped out of the car, a wave of tension seemed to rise, engulfing everything around them. Each of Larson's questions now wasn't just about determining a traffic violation. It was about finding a reason, an excuse to continue checking, to continue investigating. But Eric, with the composure of someone who understood his rights and responsibilities, didn't rush. He knew this confrontation wasn't over. It had just begun. And no matter what, Eric would stand his ground, no matter how difficult the situation became. Because he understood that this tension would determine the turning point of a confrontation not just with Larson, but with a larger system he had to face. Larson couldn't contain the frustration rising within him as he saw Eric's unwavering calmness. Every question he asked seemed like a blow, but instead of seeing fear, haste, or unease in Eric, Larson only met a cold, unshaken expression. The more they faced off, the more Larson felt like he was losing this psychological battle. And the more disappointed he became, the less he was willing to let go. At this point, Larson's voice was no longer stern. It had started to take on a bitter edge, almost provocative. "You seem awfully calm. Aren't you scared?" The question wasn't asked out of genuine curiosity, but as a challenge, a push to take Eric to his breaking point. Every word from Larson felt like a pressing blow, and every look seemed to search for a crack in Eric's self-control. But Eric, standing amidst all the tension, showed no signs of falling into the trap Larson was trying to set. He knew every move he made would be watched and judged, so he couldn't let any provocation shake his calm. Eric simply shrugged slightly, staring straight at Larson, his gaze seemingly filled with a deep understanding of the psychological games he was being pulled into. Eric's calmness only made Larson more frustrated. He moved closer, his breath quickening, no longer able to hide his sense of losing control. "What are you doing? Trying to play games with me?" Larson almost growled, and in his eyes, the tension was clear. He wanted Eric to react, to show fear, or at the very least, some sign of unease, something that others often displayed when confronted with his authority. But Eric didn't respond. He stood still, his eyes still locked with Larson's, maintaining an impenetrable calmness. And that silence became the thing that made Larson angrier than ever. He couldn't explain why someone like Eric could maintain that attitude while everything around him seemed to be against him. Every movement of Larson's became more rushed, more uncontrolled, as if he were desperately trying to break the patience that Eric was demonstrating. Yet the truth was, Eric wasn't unaware of the provocation. He knew Larson wanted him to react, wanted him to show fear, wanted to see him lose control. But Eric, with that remarkable composure, just smiled faintly, a smile that wasn't mocking, but one of patience. His gaze never left Larson's, but there was no fear, no resentment. It was like an acceptance of the challenge, but one that wouldn't easily be subdued. Inside Larson, a part of him began to doubt. Was Eric challenging his authority? Or was this just a game he couldn't understand? The sense of helplessness grew clearer for Larson as he realized nothing could break Eric's calm. This not only made him angrier, but it also made him feel wounded, as if his authority itself was being challenged and tested. The tension was now at its peak, with Larson unsure of what would happen next. But Eric still stood there, steadfast, a man resolute in the face of an unpredictable challenge. He didn't respond to the provocation, didn't react to Larson's anger, but instead left a silence, like a declaration of defiance against the judgment of the man in front of him. That silence, in itself, was a stronger message than any words that could have been spoken. As the tension in the air seemed on the verge of exploding, Eric suddenly spoke, but not to respond to the provocations Larson was intentionally aiming at. His voice, still as calm as ever, carried a clear affirmation, like a declaration of power without the need to raise his voice. "Actually, I am the Director of Internal Affairs for the Sacramento Police Department," Eric said, never taking his eyes off Larson. But this time, his gaze had shifted. It was no longer pure patience but clarity, as if he had seen through the entire game Larson was trying to set up. These words, gentle yet powerful enough to shatter the tension, hung in the air. Larson, who had been losing control, suddenly felt as though he were pushed into an unbelievable situation. He stood frozen, his eyes wide with confusion and disbelief, unable to comprehend why the man in front of him had been able to maintain such calm throughout the entire conversation. Now, Eric's challenge was no longer just a psychological test, but an assertion of status and authority that Larson never expected. Larson took a deep breath, trying to gather the chaos of emotions swirling inside him. He had never thought he would face a situation like this. In his encounters with drivers, he had always been able to dominate them with his power. But now, with Eric's brief words, Larson felt as though his confidence had been completely stripped away. In the moment of surprise, Larson swallowed and looked at Eric, as if searching for confirmation. "You are the director?" Though the question was spoken in astonishment, Larson couldn't hide the confusion in his eyes. He took a step back, completely disoriented by the sudden appearance of a position he could not deny. Eric, in no rush, maintained his composed demeanor. He knew that in situations like this, maintaining calm was not just the only strategy, but also a way to make the other party acknowledge his presence. He didn't need to make a big deal out of it, because his silence and confidence were enough to make Larson seriously consider his actions. No one wanted to face someone they knew had power, whether inside or outside the police force. "This doesn't mean I'm above you," Eric continued, his voice still steady, but this time carrying a sharpness. "However, I believe respecting rights and rules is something everyone should do, especially when we're both working in this field." Larson, faced with an undeniable truth, began to feel a sense of shame rising within him. He no longer knew what to say, only standing there as if he had suddenly realized he had unwittingly stepped into a battle for which he was unprepared. But Eric didn't let Larson's awkwardness drag on too long. He understood that the officer needed some time to regain his composure, to realize that power didn't always come from loud words or decisive actions. Sometimes, respect and steadfastness were the most important things. And as Larson began to fall silent with confusion, Eric stood there, more resolute than ever, with no change in his attitude. What had begun as a tense situation had now transformed into a confrontation of character and self-awareness. Both of them were no longer facing each other on the streets of Sacramento. They were facing the principles and responsibilities of themselves. And no matter what, Eric knew that maintaining calm in every situation was one of the strongest ways to assert control. As the atmosphere became silent, Eric maintained his calm demeanor. But now, his voice was no longer just patience, it had turned into a questioning, fully justified challenge. He looked directly at Larson, his gaze sharp, like an accusation, but not an unfounded one. Eric had seen enough situations like this, situations where power was abused, where prejudice and false assumptions were placed on others, either unintentionally or intentionally. "You didn't stop me just for a simple traffic violation," Eric began, his voice gentle but powerful. "What you're doing, the way you've treated me from the start, it's not just about a red light. This, Larson, it's bigger than that. You're displaying clear racial discrimination." Eric's words were like a slap to Larson's arrogance. The story was no longer just about a routine traffic stop, but about hidden biases, about the assumption that a black man, dressed simply, couldn't possibly be part of the very police system Larson worked within. Larson didn't respond immediately, but the feeling of confusion grew within him. He felt exposed, stripped of the protective layers he thought he had built. Eric continued, but this time with an undeniable firmness. "What you're doing, what you've done throughout this conversation, is not just escalating an unfounded traffic violation, but it's disrespect. You're not just doubting me because of what I've done, but because of who I am. You immediately assumed I had no right to be here. And that, Larson, is a disrespect that cannot be accepted." The tension in the air thickened more than ever. Eric wasn't angry, but his words were like a sharp blade cutting through the self-righteous shell Larson was wearing. What Eric was saying wasn't just criticism, it was a wake-up call about discrimination and false assumptions. A reminder that no matter who Larson was, he still had to face his own actions and the way he viewed others. Larson stood frozen, unable to respond immediately. What Eric had said echoed in his mind, like an urging he couldn't silence. He began to realize that he had let his own subjectivity drive his actions, allowing blind prejudice to dictate his thoughts and behaviors. Larson started to feel the weight in his chest, not just because of his job, but for the shortcomings in his perceptions and how he treated others. Eric didn't let Larson avoid this truth. "You might think I'm just someone who was stopped for not following traffic laws, but you don't know who I am, where I'm from, or what I represent. And if you're doubting me just because of how I look, how I dress, how I exist in this world, then you need to take a good look at yourself." Eric's words were not just personal criticism. They were a powerful message about justice, equality, and the cost of living in a society without discrimination. What Eric was facing wasn't just a simple traffic stop, it was a deep confrontation about the core values of humanity, about respect and justice in society. Larson, whether he liked it or not, couldn't escape this conversation, a conversation in which he had to reassess himself, face the actions he had taken, and, most importantly, learn to view others through a more just lens. But at this moment, as everything seemed to fall into silence, Eric sensed a shift in Larson's attitude. It wasn't an immediate, drastic change, but something small, perhaps not immediately clear, but a sign of self-awareness and the first steps toward changing the way he viewed others. The atmosphere around them seemed to grow even more still, with only the soft breaths of both men, a tension between them that was almost palpable. Eric looked into Larson's eyes, not with anger, but with maturity and deep understanding. He knew that confrontations like this weren't just about winning or losing. Right or wrong, they were about lessons that, sometimes, people only realize when standing face to face with the truth. Eric couldn't stop thinking about what had transpired, and he also knew that what he was about to say wouldn't just affect Larson, it could be a message for anyone wearing a police badge, anyone working in this society. Larson, Eric began, his voice lowering. Your badge, the thing you think is a symbol of power and authority, isn't what makes you better than anyone else. It doesn't make you the best person, it doesn't make you someone to be respected, or someone with absolute power. That badge is just a symbol, a facade, and it will never replace the responsibility that you must carry. He paused for a moment, letting his words settle into space. Larson stood there, lips pressed tightly together, perhaps feeling every word from Eric as a stern reminder of what he was doing. What Eric was saying wasn't an insult, but a warning, a reminder of the true values that someone with power must uphold. You wear this uniform, Eric continued, not to prove yourself, but to serve and protect those around you, no matter who they are or where they come from. You can do the job right, you can do it well. But if you use it to crush differences, to maintain your personal biases, then you're stripping away the very values that this badge stands for. Eric didn't speak harshly, but his words hit Larson's mind like a heavy blow. The cost of irresponsibility wasn't immediate punishment, it was the consequences that would unfold in the future, the wounds that wouldn't always heal. If Larson didn't realize this, there would come a day when he'd face unavoidable consequences, when the people no longer trusted those they entrusted to protect them. He continued, his eyes never leaving Larson. If you don't understand this, Larson, you're not just ruining your job, you're ruining a large part of the trust that people place in the police force. And that, in the end, will have unimaginable consequences. They won't see you as a protector anymore, but as someone who instills fear. The weight in the air seemed to rise even higher. Larson was silent, his eyes no longer holding the same hardened look they had before. Perhaps the truth Eric spoke had made him realize something, or perhaps it was the way Eric was looking at him, not with contempt, but with empathy that made him reflect on himself. Eric let out a quiet sigh, not out of fatigue, but out of concern for what could happen if someone didn't understand the true responsibility that their job brought. He wasn't expecting Larson to change immediately, but at least he hoped that Larson would think, that he would find a way to improve. Because, after all, anyone with power in their hands bore a huge responsibility. And sometimes, a timely warning was what could make all the difference. This time, I don't just want you to understand power, but responsibility. Power doesn't mean doing whatever you want. Power is just a tool. Responsibility is what brings real value. Eric stated firmly, his eyes filled with sincerity. And at that moment, everything became clear. Larson no longer carried arrogance, no longer carried pride. He felt the seriousness of Eric's warning that every action he took could have an impact, and if he didn't control it, it would lead to unforeseeable consequences. When the confrontation between Eric and Larson ended, the air still lingered with a heavy feeling. Eric's words were not just a lesson for Larson, but a warning for the entire system they lived and worked within. Eric could not accept what had happened and was determined that situations like this could not continue. The cost of inadequate training and improper behavior might not be immediately visible, but it would damage the community's trust, cause unnecessary tension, and drive people away from the police force. Eric could not stand by and watch the flaws in the system, and though he had played the role of a peacemaker in this situation, he knew that this incident could not end here. He decided he had to take action. Now was not the time to sit back and complain. Now was the time to push for reform, not just to protect himself, but to protect all the innocent people, to safeguard fairness and ethics in the work of law enforcement. This is no longer a personal matter, Eric told himself. What I just went through is something many people face every day. It's time to reconsider how we train our police officers, how we monitor and oversee their actions. Eric was determined to initiate a comprehensive review of the training system within the police department, with a vision not just of improving procedures, but also of redefining responsibility. The current training system may have had strengths, but the shortcomings in building relationships between the police and the community had gradually eroded the public's trust. Respect for people, fairness in every action, and responsibility to the public must be the firm foundation for everyone working in the force. Eric knew this wouldn't change overnight, but he was the one who could set an example for a crucial step in creating that change. He reflected on what he had gone through, recalled every moment of the confrontation with Larson, and realized that if the training, procedures, and oversight systems weren't changed, mistakes like this would continue to happen, and a police force that people truly trusted could never be built. He began reaching out to experts, inviting those with experience in police training and process development to organize meetings, discussions on reform options. Eric understood that change couldn't come from a single person, but had to be a system-wide effort, a comprehensive reform that everyone had a responsibility to participate in. Every step he took, every decision he made, wasn't just about dealing with a single incident, but about rebuilding trust and respect, so that one day, there would be no more situations of tension and conflict like this. Eric was no longer just the director of the Internal Affairs Division of the Sacramento Police Department. He had become a leader, a change-maker, striving to create a more just and safer environment for everyone. That was what Eric wanted to achieve. Not just to stand at the top and criticize, but to change how the police interacted with the community, how each person in this field understood and carried out their responsibilities. And this incident was just a warning signal, a reminder that if things didn't improve, this system would never meet the public's expectations, and it wouldn't be able to protect the most important values in society. After weeks of relentless work and tense meetings and discussions, Eric was ready for an important step. He would speak at a public forum, where thousands would listen to his words. This was not just a simple speech. It was a commitment, a promise to the community that change would come, and fairness and integrity would be the guiding principles for all actions within the police force. As he stepped up to the podium, Eric felt the eyes of everyone on him. Each person there had their own story, their own worries, their own anxieties when facing the police force. That feeling was not easy, but Eric understood that this was the moment for him to speak up about what he believed in, to emphasize that change was not just a slogan, but a responsibility, an obligation that every officer, every person in this community had to fulfill. With a voice full of sincerity and determination, Eric began his speech. We cannot allow incidents, actions lacking fairness and responsibility, to continue within our police force. I understand that at times people feel uneasy, feel they are treated unfairly, and that is unacceptable. He paused for a moment, letting his words sink into everyone's minds. That's why I commit to change. We will not just stop at promises, but we will take action. Fairness is not just an ideal. It must be a reality in every one of our decisions. Integrity must be the foundation in all our actions, from traffic stops to how we interact with the community. The room fell silent, everyone hanging on to every word Eric spoke. These words were not just a call for change, but a firm statement that the responsibility of the police was not only to maintain order, but also to protect the rights, dignity, and fairness for all, regardless of race, gender, or background. Eric continued, "The police are not above the people. We are here to serve the community, and every action we take must be scrutinized, evaluated, and monitored fairly. Respect for human dignity is not a choice. It is a prerequisite in the work of every officer." The room seemed to quiet even further, the atmosphere growing heavy but also full of hope. Eric was not just speaking about change. He was sharing specific plans to ensure that the police force would never let mistakes like the one in the previous incident happen again. He promised to implement comprehensive reforms in training, enhance oversight, and rebuild the community's trust in the police. It was a long journey, But Eric believed that with determination and faith in integrity, he and his colleagues could overcome it together. At the end of his speech, Eric looked out over the crowd, his gaze not just one of confidence, but also a call for everyone to come together. We will not stop. That is my promise, and I will do everything in my power to keep that promise. Because we deserve a just society, where everyone feels safe and respected. Eric's words were like a light in the darkness, a beacon of hope for a future where the police and the community could build together, a place where everyone could live in fairness and respect. And in that moment, everyone in the room could feel the power of change, starting from one person but radiating out to the entire community. Give me your comments on this story. Follow my channel to receive notifications about the latest videos.